Hospitals have always made me uneasy, but St. Gabriel's was something different. It was an old, decrepit building that had been shut down for over a decade. I had only heard rumors, dark ones. People said it was haunted, that patients who died there were never at peace, that they roamed the halls in the dead of night. But I didn't believe in any of that. Or at least, I didn't until I ended up working there. The hospital had been abandoned, but the city was in dire need of an overflow space due to a surge in patients, so they reopened it in a hurry, cutting corners. I was part of a small crew of nurses and doctors assigned to manage the night shift during the transition. There were only 6 of us working that night. Myself, Dr. Reynolds, 2 other nurses, Sarah and Greg, and 2 orderlies, Kevin and Mark. The first few nights were quiet, but on the 4th night, things changed. It started around 1:30 a.m. when Greg and I were doing rounds. The halls were dim and the building creaked constantly. As we passed room 302, Greg paused and looked confused. "I thought this room was empty," he whispered, frowning at the door. I checked my chart. He was right. It was supposed to be empty. But as we stood there, I swore I heard the faint sound of breathing from the other side. "Probably just a draft or something," I muttered. Even though I knew a draft doesn't sound like that, we decided to check it out anyway. When we opened the door, the room was cold, unnaturally cold. And in the corner, there was a bed, just like in the other rooms. But the sheets on this one were disturbed, wrinkled like someone had been lying in them. Yet, no one was there. Greg and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to leave as quickly as possible. But before we could, the door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing down the hall. The lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally turned it on, I froze. In the beam of light, I could see the outline of someone, or something, standing at the foot of the bed. A shadowy figure, indistinct, but unmistakably there. Greg let out a choked gasp, and I knew he saw it too. Neither of us moved. The figure didn't either. Then, slowly, it turned its head toward us. Even though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes boring into me, colder than the air around us. "We need to leave," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. But my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward. Just one step, but it was enough to break the spell. Greg grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the door. We fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figure took another step, and I could hear a faint whisper, like a distant voice trying to speak through a wall. "It's locked," Greg shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Keep trying," I yelled back, shining the flashlight around, trying to find something, anything, to defend ourselves. The figure was halfway across the room now, gliding silently toward us. Then, just as suddenly as it had locked, the door flew open. Greg and I stumbled out into the hall, slamming it shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we were back at the nurse's station, breathless and shaking. Sarah and Dr. Reynolds were there, looking concerned. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear as she took in our pale faces. There's something in room 302, I gasped. Dr. Reynolds frowned. "That's impossible. The power's been out in that wing since we reopened. No one's supposed to be in there." Greg and I insisted we saw something, but the doctor wasn't convinced. He decided to go check it out himself. Against my better judgment, I followed him back to the room, Greg trailing behind, muttering that we should just leave. When we arrived, the door to room 302 was wide open. Dr. Reynolds stepped inside without hesitation. I hesitated in the doorway, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. "It's empty," Dr. Reynolds said, turning to us with an exasperated expression. "See? Nothing." He stopped mid-sentence, his face twisted in confusion as he looked at the bed. The sheets were perfectly neat, as if no one had touched them. But Greg and I knew they had been disturbed just moments ago. Dr. Reynolds walked to the bed, pulling the sheets back. There, lying underneath, was something that made my blood run cold. A patient bracelet, yellowed with age. The name was faded, but the date of admission was clear. September 17, 1985, over 30 years ago. The doctor stared at it for a moment, then shook his head. Probably just some old equipment left behind. But I knew it wasn't that simple. For the rest of the night, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners of our vision, and the temperature dropped every time we passed room 302. The whispers grew louder too, echoing through the empty halls. By 4 a.m., we had all gathered back at the nurse's station, too afraid to leave each other's sight. Mark, the orderly, was the first to break. "We have to get out of here. This place, it's wrong." None of us argued. As we prepared to leave, I glanced down the hall one last time toward room 302, and there, standing in the doorway, was the shadowy figure. It didn't move, didn't chase us. It just watched. We never returned to St. Gabriel's after that night. The city shut it down for good a week later, citing structural issues. But we knew the truth. Whatever haunted that hospital was still there, waiting. And I'll never forget those whispers, the ones that still echo in my nightmares. Get out before it's too late. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was my 3rd month working the night shift at Mercy Hills, a small forgotten hospital on the outskirts of town. Most of the patients were elderly or terminally ill, but with how little foot traffic we had, the nights were long, boring, and quiet. Too quiet sometimes. But one night, the quiet was broken in the worst possible way. I was the only nurse on duty that evening. It was a typical night, checking on patients, adjusting IVs, making notes in the dimly lit nurse's station. Mercy Hills was old, and it felt like it, with its flickering fluorescent lights, pale green walls, and the constant groan of the building settling. Most of the other staff hated working nights there, but I didn't mind. Or at least, I didn't until that night. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I noticed something off. Room 212's call light blinked on at the end of the hall. That was strange because room 212 had been empty for weeks. It was being renovated after some of the equipment broke and no one had been assigned there. I figured it was just a glitch in the system. These things happen sometimes. Still, I figured I'd better check it out just to be safe. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the dim corridor. The air seemed heavier as I approached room 212. Colder, too, like I had stepped into a freezer. I brushed it off as nerves and opened the door. The room was dark and still. Everything was in its place. The bed was bare, the machines covered with sheets, and the blinds drawn tightly shut. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like sheets being disturbed. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the bed, expecting to see nothing. But what I saw made my heart stop. The bed wasn't empty anymore. Lying under the sheets was the distinct shape of a person. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure, motionless, lying there. The outline was faint but unmistakable, a body covered by the white hospital sheets. I could feel the blood drain from my face. This room was empty, I reminded myself. No one had been assigned here for weeks. No one was supposed to be here. Hello? My voice trembled, barely above a whisper. No answer. I took a cautious step forward, the light shaking in my hand. I reached the side of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I lifted the corner of the sheet. Beneath it was nothing, just an empty mattress. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. My mind had to be playing tricks on me. I threw the sheet back over the bed and quickly backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. I told myself it was just exhaustion, the result of too many night shifts in a row. But as I walked back to the nurse's station, the hall felt longer. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, and the air was still so cold. I returned to my station and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. I went back to filling out paperwork, forcing myself to focus on anything other than what had just happened. But not 5 minutes later, the call light for room 212 blinked on again. My stomach dropped. There was no way that was a coincidence. I stared at the light, my hands shaking. No, this can't be real, I muttered under my breath. I stood up, hesitating for just a moment before grabbing my flashlight again. This time I didn't walk slowly. I hurried down the hall, determined to figure out what was going on. Maybe the wiring was messed up, or maybe there was some kind of malfunction. I had to believe there was a logical explanation. I reached room 212 and opened the door again, stepping inside with my heart pounding in my ears. The room was still as cold as before. I swept the flashlight across the room, and at first, nothing seemed out of place. The bed was still made, the machine still covered. I sighed in relief. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The door had closed so fast, and now the handle wouldn't budge. I pulled at it, but it felt like it was being held shut from the other side. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even lower, like I was standing in a freezer. My breath came out in short, visible puffs. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, with only my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Then I heard it again, the rustling sound, from the bed. I whipped around, shining the flashlight on the bed. The sheets were moving, slowly, deliberately, like something was underneath them. I could see the faint outline of a body rising up, forming under the covers. My mouth went dry as the figure slowly sat up. My flashlight shook as I pointed at the bed. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. The figure under the sheet turned toward me, though I couldn't see a face, only the outline of its form. Then it started to speak, in a voice so faint it sounded like it was coming from deep underwater. Help me. My legs finally listened to my brain. I bolted for the door, yanking at the handle until it finally gave way. I stumbled into the hall, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. My heart was racing, my skin covered in cold sweat. I didn't go back to room 212 that night. I didn't tell anyone what I saw either, afraid they'd think I was losing my mind. But I wasn't. I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. And ever since that night, room 212's call light continues to blink on at exactly 2:30 a.m. No matter how many times they try to fix it, it never stops. Someone in that room is still waiting for help.
Story number 3.
Hospitals have a way of getting under your skin, especially at night. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but working as a night nurse at St. Mary's changed that. You hear the usual stories, cold spots, mysterious footsteps, but it's easy to shrug off until you experience it yourself. It was just a few weeks into my new job, and I was already used to the long, lonely hours. My shift usually consisted of making rounds, filling out charts, and occasionally checking on patients in the ICU. The hospital was mostly quiet at night, but there was one part of the building that no one ever talked about, the West Wing. It had been closed for years after a fire damaged most of the rooms, and it was supposedly under renovation, but I had never seen anyone working on it. Still, we were told to steer clear. Of course, the West Wing had a reputation. Rumors circulated about a nurse who had died there years ago under mysterious circumstances. Some said she committed suicide. Others claimed it was something far worse. Her name was Helen, and the story went that she haunted the halls, looking for something or someone. I never thought much of the stories, that is, until one particularly eerie night. It was around 3 a.m., and I was sitting at the nurse's station, half asleep, sipping on bad coffee. The hospital was dead quiet, save for the occasional beep from a patient's monitor. Out of nowhere, I heard a noise, a faint, distant hum, like a voice. I stood up, straining to hear. It was coming from down the hall, from the direction of the West Wing. My heart raced. No one was supposed to be over there, and the doors leading to that section were always locked. But the voice was unmistakable now, a soft, whispered cry. Someone was calling out. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. The hallways were dark, only dimly lit by the emergency lights. The farther I walked, the colder it got. It was the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones, and I shivered despite myself. I reached the doors to the West Wing and paused. The voice had stopped. Everything was silent again. I should have turned back right then, but something pulled me forward. I reached for the door, expecting it to be locked like usual, but it wasn't. The handle turned easily in my hand, and the door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black corridor. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of burnt wood still lingered from the fire all those years ago. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the long, narrow hallway. Most of the doors were shut, but at the far end, one was slightly ajar. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I approached the open door. The air grew even colder, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. A light was on in the room beyond the door, a soft yellow glow spilling out into the hallway. But that didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been power in the West Wing. The whole section had been shut down. I hesitated in front of the door, my hand shaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was eerily still. It looked like any other hospital room, except everything was covered in a layer of dust. The bed was made, though, with crisp white sheets that looked brand new, untouched by time. But there was something else, an old wooden rocking chair in the corner of the room. It was moving, slowly back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. My stomach turned. I felt a presence behind me, a soft whisper in my ear. "Help me." I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my grip, but there was no one there. I backed away from the rocking chair, my eyes darting around the room. That's when I noticed it, the old, faded patient chart hanging on the wall. I walked over, wiping away the dust to reveal a name, Helen Wilcox. My blood ran cold. The nurse, the one who had died here. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the lights flickered. The rocking chair stopped moving, and the room fell into an unnatural silence. I raced to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as the air grew heavier, thick with a sense of something wrong. I could feel it now, something watching me, something angry. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment I saw her, a woman in a nurse's uniform standing in the corner of the room, her face obscured by shadows. She didn't move, didn't speak, she just stared. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the figure. She stepped forward, her footsteps silent, but the room seemed to tremble with each step. I fumbled for my flashlight, shining it toward her, but she vanished, disappearing as soon as the light touched her. And then, as if nothing had happened, the door swung open. I didn't think twice. I bolted from the room, my legs shaking as I sprinted down the hallway, not stopping until I was back at the nurse's station. My hands were trembling so badly that I knocked over my coffee cup, sending it crashing to the floor. But I didn't care. I was too shaken, too terrified to even breathe. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that it was the late hour and the exhaustion messing with my head. But I knew better. I could still feel the cold, still hear the whispered cry. The next day, I asked one of the older nurses about Helen. She just looked at me, her face pale, and said, "Helen was real. She died in the West Wing during the fire. They say she was trying to save a patient, but some believe it was something else, something darker." I never went near the West Wing again after that night, but every now and then during the quietest part of my shift, I hear it again, a soft whisper, a faint cry for help coming from down the hall, and I know she's still there. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I never thought my first job as a night nurse at Willow Creek Hospital would turn into a nightmare. After finishing nursing school, I was eager to make a difference, but the reality of night shifts proved to be unsettling. The hospital had a long history, and some whispered stories about strange occurrences and shadows lingering in the hallways. I brushed them off. It was just a job, after all. But then came my first night shift. The clock struck midnight, and I was just finishing my rounds. Most patients were sleeping soundly, and the only sound in the ward was the rhythmic beeping of monitors. I settled down at the nurse's station with a cup of lukewarm coffee, flipping through charts. That's when I heard it, a soft, feeble voice drifting through the quiet. "Help me." I sat up, straining to listen. The voice seemed to come from the far end of the hall, a room I had just passed. Room 404. I looked at the chart. It was empty. No patient was supposed to be in there. My heart raced. I had just checked on all the patients. There shouldn't be anyone in that room. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the dimly lit corridor, the air growing heavier with each step. The overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting shadows that danced along the walls. I reached room 404 and found the door slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight creeping through the window. The bed was empty, sheets pulled tightly. The faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time clearer. It came from the corner of the room. I turned my flashlight in that direction. My heart stopped. There, standing in the shadows, was a woman dressed in a pale hospital gown. Her hair hung long and tangled around her face, obscuring her features. She looked gaunt, her skin pale as if drained of all color. Her eyes met mine, dark and haunting. "Please, help me," pleaded again, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" I managed to say, my voice shaky. "What do you need?" She took a step closer, but instead of moving toward me, she seemed to glide, her feet barely touching the floor. I felt a chill run down my spine as a sense of dread washed over me. "I can't leave," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm trapped here." Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I whirled around, frantically pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I turned back to face the woman, who was now closer. Too close. "Why are you here?" I asked, backing away until my back hit the wall. "I need you to remember me," she whispered, her voice now a haunting echo. "You're the only one." Suddenly the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room. I blinked in shock. The woman was now standing right in front of me, her expression a mix of sorrow and desperation. I could see her clearer now, the hollowness in her eyes sending a shiver down my spine. "I was the last patient," she said, her voice fading to a whisper. "They forgot me. I died here, but no one knew." My heart raced as the memory flooded back. I remembered reading about a young woman who had been admitted for a routine procedure. Something had gone wrong, and she had passed away in this very room. The hospital had declared her a lost case, a patient who slipped through the cracks of a chaotic system. "Please, help me move on," she pleaded, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "I can't find peace." I reached for the door again, desperation surging through me. "I'm trying. I don't know how to help you." Suddenly, the lights flickered again and the air grew colder. The shadows around her seemed to stretch, dark tendrils wrapping around her like chains. "Remember me," she cried, her voice echoing through the room. "You're the only one who can set me free." In that moment, I realized I had to acknowledge her pain. "I remember you," I shouted, my voice echoing. "You were here. You were real. I see you." The shadows receded slightly, and her expression softened, though sorrow lingered in her eyes. "You believe me?" "Yes," I yelled, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're not forgotten, I promise." The room trembled, and the temperature dropped sharply. The woman took a step back, her face a mixture of hope and despair. "Thank you. Now I can finally leave." With a soft sigh, she began to fade, her form dissolving into shimmering light. The shadows that had enveloped her melted away, and I felt a warmth spread through the room. Just as quickly as it had begun, the door swung open, and I stumbled out into the corridor, gasping for air. I looked back, half expecting to see her still there, but the room was empty, quiet. The lights above flickered back to their usual steady glow. I leaned against the wall, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. I had felt her pain, her longing to be remembered, and somehow I had helped her find peace. The rest of the night was a blur, but I felt different. The weight of the hospital's history and its lost souls had lifted, even if only slightly. The following days passed, but I never forgot that night in room 404. I made it a point to remember every patient, every story, because I didn't want anyone else to be forgotten again. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the hospital at night, I swear I can still hear her voice echoing softly through the halls, a gentle reminder that sometimes the past needs to be acknowledged to find peace. Story the end.
Story number 5.
As a freshly minted nurse at Riverside Memorial, I was eager to dive into my new role. The hospital had a good reputation, and I was excited to make a difference. However, I quickly learned that the night shift was a whole different world, a realm where whispers echoed in the halls and shadows danced just out of reach. It was a Wednesday night, around 1 a.m., when I first encountered room 312. I had just finished my rounds and was settling in at the nurse's station, sipping on a bitter cup of coffee. The hospital was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. But that's when I heard it, a faint, soft sobbing coming from the direction of room 312. I froze, my heart racing. I knew that room was supposed to be empty. It had been closed off for months, ever since the last patient had been moved to the ICU. Curious and a bit concerned, I stood up and walked toward the sound. As I approached the door, I could hear the sobbing more clearly now. It was pitiful, filled with anguish. "Help me," a voice whispered, barely audible. I hesitated, but something compelled me to knock on the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Is anyone in there?" The sobbing stopped instantly. The sudden silence made my skin crawl. I waited, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no response. Something felt wrong. I grasped the doorknob, expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it turned easily. As I pushed the door open, a chill rushed over me. The air was thick and heavy, and the room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Inside, the room was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and the bed was unmade, as if someone had been hastily pulled from it. But there was no one there. "Hello?" I said again, stepping inside. My voice echoed off the walls, amplifying the sense of isolation. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is anyone here?" That's when I noticed it, the mirror above the sink, cracked and dirty. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't feel like me. The reflection was distorted, twisting the features into something grotesque. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of the image before me. Suddenly, I saw a figure behind me in the mirror. I whirled around, but the room was still empty. A cold sweat broke out on my brow as I turned back to the mirror. There, in the glass, I could see her, a woman in a hospital gown, her hair disheveled and face streaked with tears. She looked right at me, and my heart dropped when she was whispered, "Help me, please." "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, Her reflection began to fade, and I felt a pull, like a dark force dragging me toward the mirror. I stumbled back, bumping into the bed. "Get out!" I shouted, but the room seemed to close in around me. The temperature dropped sharply, and a sense of dread washed over me. "Help me," the voice came again, clearer now, almost desperate. "You must help me." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. "I can't help you. I don't even know who you are." Her reflection transformed, revealing a horrifying visage. The woman's eyes turned black, and her mouth twisted into a sinister smile. "You must remember," she hissed. "You're the only one who can help me." In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of fear, but also something else: recognition. I searched my memory and recalled a case from a few months back about a patient named Rebecca, a young woman who had been admitted after a severe accident. She had slipped into a coma and had been pronounced dead a week later. The nurses had always talked about how she had been so full of life before the accident, and how her spirit seemed to linger in the hospital after her death. "Rebecca?" I breathed, realization dawning on me. "Remember me," she whispered, her voice now laced with urgency. "You must remember what happened." Suddenly, the room swirled around me and memories flooded back. I could see Rebecca laughing, her eyes sparkling with joy before the accident. Then darkness enveloped the image, and I could hear the frantic voices of the doctors and nurses who had tried to save her. "They thought I was gone," her voice echoed, tinged with sorrow. "But I'm still here. I can't leave this place until someone knows the truth." "What truth?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "What do you need me to do?" "Tell them," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Tell them I'm still here. I want to go home." The air grew heavier, and I felt an overwhelming urge to help her. I took a deep breath and nodded, determined. "I'll tell them. I promise." At that moment, the shadows in the room began to recede, and Rebecca's expression softened. "Thank you," she said, her voice now gentle and soothing. "Thank you for believing in me." With those words, the room brightened, and the oppressive weight lifted. I felt a rush of warmth and relief. And then, just like that, she vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of peace in her wake. The mirror returned to normal, reflecting the room as it should be. I stood there for a moment, breathless and shaken, before finally stepping back. I knew I had to keep my promise. The next day, I gathered the staff and told them everything I had experienced in room 312. At first, they were skeptical, but as I recounted Rebecca's story, their expressions shifted from doubt to concern. Together, we honored her memory, remembering the young woman who had been forgotten. After that night, I never heard her voice again, but every now and then when I pass by room 312, I feel a warm breeze, as if she's finally found her way home. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I always thought I was ready for anything that came with being a night nurse at Crestwood Hospital. I had trained for years and had heard every horror story imaginable about hospitals, especially the one about Ward 7. It was the oldest part of the hospital, known for its eerie atmosphere and whispered tales of the spirits that still roamed the halls. Most nurses dismissed the stories as folklore, but they still gave the ward a wide berth. I shrugged it off. What could a few ghost stories do? After all, I was there to care for the living. It was my third night shift when the unease crept in. The hospital was quieter than usual. Even the machines in the ICU seemed to hum at a lower frequency. I finished my rounds and headed to Ward 7 to check on the few patients who still occupied its rooms. As I stepped inside, a chill swept through me, causing the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, and I could feel an unsettling presence hanging in the air. I walked down the narrow hallway, peeking into each room. Most patients were sleeping, but in room 703, a faint glow caught my eye. I approached, and the door creaked open slightly. Inside, a young girl sat up in her bed, her face pale and gaunt. She looked no older than 10, with dark circles under her eyes and an expression of profound sadness. "Can you see her?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "See who?" I asked, my heart racing. "The lady in the corner," she said, pointing toward the far side of the room. I turned my gaze to the corner, but there was nothing there, just shadows creeping from the walls. "There's no one there, sweetie," I replied, trying to reassure her. The girl's eyes widened with fear. "No, she's there. She's always there. She won't let me sleep." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What does she look like?" I asked cautiously. "She wears a long white dress and her hair is all wet and tangled," the girl replied, trembling. "She cries a lot. She wants something." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I tried to comfort the girl, but the fear in her eyes was palpable. "You're safe here," I said gently. Just focus on my voice. You'll be okay. As I turned to leave the room, I felt a sudden chill sweep through me. The fluorescent lights flickered wildly, and I heard a soft whisper in my ear, almost like a gentle breeze. Help her. I jumped, glancing back at the girl, but she was staring at the corner, her face a mask of terror. She wants you to help her, she repeated, her voice quivering. Help her how? I asked, more to myself than anyone else. But there was no answer. The rest of my shift was uneventful, but the girl's words haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in Ward 7. The next night, I was determined to find out more. I arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the archives, hoping to uncover the history of Ward 7. The old records were dusty and worn, but as I flipped through them, one name kept appearing: Sarah Jenkins, a little girl who had died in that very ward decades ago. She was only 8 years old, and her death was attributed to an undiagnosed illness. I felt a pang of sadness as I read her story. It seemed she had never truly left the ward. The more I delved into the records, the more I uncovered. Accounts of other patients who had reported seeing a girl in a white dress wandering the halls, always looking for something she had lost. That night, I returned to Ward 7 with a heavy heart. I had to confront whatever spirit lingered there. I found the little girl in room 703 again, her expression unchanged. Are you okay? I asked, kneeling beside her bed. She's still here, the girl said, pointing to the corner once more. She's sad. What does she want? I pressed, feeling a mix of dread and determination. She wants her mommy, the girl whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. She's scared. My heart ached for both of them. What if we help her? I suggested, my voice shaking. What if we try to find her mother? The girl nodded slowly, hope flickering in her eyes. Do you think it will work? I have to try, I said, feeling a sense of purpose wash over me. I closed my eyes, focusing on the energy in the room. Sarah, I called softly. If you can hear me, we want to help you find your mother. At first, nothing happened. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows felt heavier. But then I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and the lights flickered violently. I opened my eyes to see the girl staring wide-eyed at the corner. Look, she cried. In the shadows, a figure began to take shape, a translucent woman in a long, flowing dress. Her hair hung limply, and her face was streaked with tears. It was Sarah's mother. Help me find her, the woman whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. I took a deep breath. We're here, Sarah. We're here to help you find your mom, I shouted, my voice echoing in the room. The girl's eyes widened with fear and hope. Mommy! The ghostly figure began to move toward the girl, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. It's okay. You can be together, I encouraged them. As the mother reached out to the girl, the lights flickered one last time before going out completely. I could hear soft cries and whispers, but then the air grew still. When the lights flickered back on, the room was empty. No sign of the girl, no sign of her mother. Panic surged through me as I rushed to check the other rooms, but Ward 7 was silent. I returned to room 703, my heart pounding. The bed was unmade, but the girl was gone. Days passed, and I never saw her again. I inquired about her, but the records showed no one by that name had ever been admitted. Still, I felt a sense of peace, knowing I had helped Sarah and her mother reunite, finally freeing them from the confines of Ward 7. But I will never forget the look in that little girl's eyes, the fear, the sadness, and the hope. Even now, when I walk through the halls of Crestwood Hospital at night, I sometimes hear a whisper in the shadows. Help me, but I know I've done all I can. And for Sarah, that was enough.
Story number 7.
The first night I stepped into Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital, I was filled with both excitement and dread. It was my first job as a night nurse, and though I had heard the tales of the old hospital, its long history of mysterious disappearances and unsettling events, I had always brushed them off as urban legends. But that night, as I settled in for my shift, the atmosphere felt heavy. The dim lights flickered ominously, casting long shadows along the walls, and the distant echoes of murmurs and cries floated through the halls, creating a haunting symphony. As I began my rounds, I was immediately drawn to the first floor, where the most unstable patients were housed. The wards were silent, except for the occasional soft rustle of sheets or a low moaning sound. But then I reached room 107. Inside, a patient named Eleanor sat on her bed, her hair hanging in greasy strands over her face. She had been admitted after a breakdown, and her eyes held a wildness that made my heart race. Help me, she murmured, barely glancing up. What do you need, Eleanor? I asked gently, trying to maintain my composure. The walls, they talk. she whispered, her voice trembling. They whisper terrible things. I frowned, trying to interpret her words. What do they say? They tell me to go home, she replied, a tear sliding down her cheek. But I don't know where home is anymore. Eleanor, you're safe here, I assured her, though doubt crept in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I continued my rounds, but the echoes of Eleanor's words haunted me. The whispering walls? I rolled my eyes. I was a nurse, not a ghostbuster. But as I made my way down the dimly lit corridor, I began to feel the atmosphere shift. The air grew colder, and I swore I could hear faint whispers slithering through the cracks. Help us, they seemed to say, and I froze in my tracks. The voices were soft and distant, like a chorus of the long forgotten. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was tired. The lack of sleep must have been getting to me. I finished my rounds and settled back at the nurse's station, where I tried to focus on the paperwork, but the whispers persisted, growing louder. I decided to investigate. I stood up and walked toward the main hall, where the whispers seemed to intensify. The lights flickered again, and I could feel an unseen presence looming over me. Help us. The voice was clearer now, almost urgent. I pressed forward, following the sound, until I reached the door to the old therapy room. The door creaked open, revealing an empty space filled with broken furniture and peeling paint. As I stepped inside, I felt a chill wash over me. Who's there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Show yourself! For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a soft giggle echoing through the room. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was no one there. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. I glanced toward the far corner of the room and saw a shadow dart behind the old therapy chair. I moved closer, the air thick with tension. Hello? I called out again, my voice shaking. Is anyone there? The giggle echoed again, but this time it morphed into a low, eerie whisper. Help us. Help us. I felt a surge of fear, and I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic gripped me as I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. Help us. We are lost. Trapped. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices, but they flooded my mind, drowning me in sorrow and despair. I could almost see them, ghostly figures trapped within the walls of the hospital. Help us, they cried, their voices melding into a haunting chorus. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room fell silent, the air still. I opened my eyes to find the door creak open. With trembling hands, I rushed out into the hallway, gasping for breath. I hurried back to the nurse's station, desperate to calm my racing heart. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to regain my composure. But the whispers lingered, echoing in the corners of my mind. As the night dragged on, I kept my ears peeled for any sign of the supernatural. I checked on my patients, but Eleanor was the only one still awake, her eyes wide and filled with fear. Did you hear them? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hear who? I replied, my heart pounding. The whispers. They want to escape, she said, trembling. They can't. They're trapped. Eleanor, it's just the building settling, I lied, trying to reassure both her and myself, but deep down I felt a chilling truth. The hospital was a maze of forgotten souls, and their whispers were growing stronger. Around 3 a.m., I was summoned to room 105, where a patient had collapsed. I rushed in, but the moment I entered, a freezing breeze swept past me, extinguishing the lights. I could hear the faint whispers, clearer than before, urging me to listen. Help us! Help us! I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. I'm here to help! I shouted, hoping it would somehow silence the cries. But the walls seemed to close in around me, pressing against my chest. And then I saw them, a group of figures materializing before me. Their faces were pale and etched with despair, each one reaching out as if to pull me into their world. Help us! They cried, their voices echoing in my mind. I stumbled back, panic surging through me. I had to escape. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I banged against it, yelling for someone to help, but my voice echoed back, empty. Help us, they repeated, their voices merging into a cacophony of sorrow. You can set us free. In that moment, I realized that their cries were not for me. They were a plea for release. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down, focusing on Eleanor's words. Maybe if I acknowledged their pain, they would find peace. I hear you, I shouted into the darkness. I will remember you. I will tell your stories. The shadows began to swirl around me, and I could feel a warm light breaking through the darkness. The whispers quieted, replaced by a soothing presence. Thank you, they whispered, their voices now softer, more melodic. Thank you. With that, the figures began to fade, and the door swung open, revealing a path back into the hallway. I stumbled out, gasping for air, the weight of the darkness lifting as dawn began to break. The whispers were gone, replaced by the gentle hum of the hospital waking up. I rushed to the nurse's station and collapsed into a chair, trembling but relieved. That day, I made a promise to remember each patient I encountered, to honor their stories and ensure they would never be forgotten. As I walked through the halls of Blackwood Hospital, I felt a newfound sense of purpose. And every now and then, when the wind rustles through the trees outside, I hear their whispers again, gentle reminders of the souls I helped free. Story the end.
Story number 8.
As a nurse at Crescent Hill Hospital, I had always prided myself on my ability to handle the unexpected. But nothing could prepare me for the strange events that unfolded during my night shifts. It was a chilly October night when I first heard the story of Room 9. The tale was whispered among the staff, recounting how a patient had mysteriously disappeared years ago, and the room had remained untouched ever since. According to the stories, the ghost of the patient still roamed the halls searching for help. Most of my colleagues dismissed it as mere superstition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that room. That night, as I made my rounds, I noticed that the hallway was quieter than usual. The usual hum of activity felt stifled, almost suffocating. I passed by Room 9, its door slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt an urge to push it open. Inside, the room was dark and still. The bed was perfectly made, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Dust particles danced in the thin shaft of moonlight that slipped through the window. As I stepped inside, a sense of unease washed over me. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper. "Help me." It was faint but unmistakable. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. There was no response, just the overwhelming silence of the room. Shaking off the unease, I turned to leave, but the door creaked shut behind me. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door. "Let me out!" The whispering returned, louder now. "Help me, please." "Who are you?" I shouted, fear tightening my throat. "Find me. Remember me." The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. I had to think logically. This was just a hospital. There had to be a reason for the door to be stuck. "Just let me out," I pleaded, slamming my shoulder against the door once more. Finally, with a loud crack, the door swung open, and I stumbled back into the hallway, gasping for breath. I took a moment to steady myself, feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The whispers faded, but I could still feel the weight of something watching me. I returned to the nurse's station, trying to push the encounter from my mind. As the night wore on, however, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to uncover the truth about Room 9. I pulled up the hospital records on the computer, searching for any information about the mysterious patient who had vanished. To my surprise, the records were sparse. All I found was a name, Evelyn Carter, a young woman admitted years ago for severe depression. She had reportedly experienced a breakdown and had been placed in Room 9. The records indicated that she had been stable for some time, but had suddenly disappeared without a trace. I was intrigued and horrified at the same time. Why had no one spoken of her disappearance? What had happened to her? I felt a chill settle over me. Determined to find out more, I decided to confront the whispers again. I returned to Room 9, my heart racing. I took a deep breath and opened the door, bracing myself for whatever lay inside. "Evelyn?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" The room was as I had left it, but the air felt charged. I stepped inside and the temperature dropped dramatically. I could feel the presence around me, almost palpable. "Help me," the whisper echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls. "Help me find peace." "I'm here to help you," I said, my voice shaking. "What do you need?" "Remember me. Remember my story." The walls seemed to close in, and I felt an overwhelming sense of despair wash over me. "I promise I will remember," I said desperately. "Just tell me how to help you." Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, and a figure appeared before me. It was a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her face obscured by shadows. "Evelyn?" I whispered, my heart pounding. "Help me," she repeated, her voice a haunting melody. "I am lost, trapped in this place." "What happened to you?" I asked, tears pricking my eyes. "I was forgotten," she replied, her voice breaking. "No one came for me. I wanted to be free." A wave of guilt crashed over me as I realized the truth. Evelyn had been abandoned, lost in the system while she battled her demons. "I'll remember you," I promised. "I'll make sure everyone knows your name." Thank you, she whispered, her figure beginning to fade. I can finally rest. As her presence dissipated, the oppressive weight in the room lifted. The air warmed, and I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. After that night, I made it my mission to ensure that Evelyn's story was told. I shared her name with my colleagues, and I started a small support group for the hospital staff to discuss mental health and the importance of not letting anyone slip through the cracks. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, we held a small ceremony to honor her memory. And though the whispers in room 9 ceased, I knew that Evelyn's spirit had found peace. The story of her life and struggles would not be forgotten again. Story the end.
Story number 9.
Working as a night nurse at Green Hollow Hospital, I had always been accustomed to the eerie stillness of the night shifts. The rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional rustle of paper were the usual sounds that filled the halls. But there was something particularly unsettling about this particular night. A storm raged outside, thunder booming like ominous footsteps in the distance. As I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a feeling I had experienced many times before, especially in the hospital's oldest wing, which housed the psychiatric ward. The stories about this place were legendary. Patients who had gone mad, strange occurrences, and whispers that echoed through the corridors at night. I had heard the tales of room 12, where a patient had mysteriously vanished during a storm, just like this one years ago. The stories varied. Some said she had escaped, while others claimed she had been taken by the shadows. Staff members often warned newcomers to stay away from that room, saying that the whispers could drive anyone insane. Despite my apprehension, I felt an irresistible pull toward room 12. As I approached, the hallway grew colder, and the lights flickered ominously overhead. I hesitated for a moment, peering through the small glass window in the door. The room appeared empty, the bed neatly made, but I could sense an unsettling energy within. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. As soon as I stepped inside, a rush of cold air enveloped me, sending a shiver down my spine. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon, shining through the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here?" Silence hung heavy in the air, but then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Help me, please." My heart raced, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Who are you?" I demanded, forcing myself to sound brave. "Help me. I'm trapped." The voice was sorrowful, echoing in the dark corners of the room. I stepped further inside, feeling compelled to find the source. "What do you need?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't leave," the voice lamented. "You have to remember me." Suddenly, the temperature dropped even more, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, swirling and shifting as if alive. Panic began to claw at my insides, but I took a deep breath and pressed on. "I'll remember you. Just tell me your name." "I was Lily," the voice whispered, filled with pain. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to go home." My heart sank. I knew of Lily. She had been a patient in this ward, a girl whose mental health deteriorated rapidly after a traumatic event. The stories said she had been deeply troubled and had vanished one stormy night. "Lily, I'm here for you," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't have to be afraid." "Help me find my way home," she pleaded, the sorrow in her voice piercing through the shadows. "They forgot me. No one came for me." The walls began to close in, the shadows thickening around me. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I recoiled, fear flooding my veins. "I can't help you if you're trapped here," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "You need to show me how." For a moment, there was silence. Then the shadows swirled violently, and I saw a glimpse of her. A pale figure standing in the corner, her hair long and tangled, her eyes filled with a haunting sadness. "Find my mother," she whispered. "Tell her I'm still here." "Where can I find her?" I asked, stepping closer despite the terror coursing through me. "In the hospital records," she murmured, her voice growing fainter. "You'll see. Remember me." The room began to spin, and I felt as if I was being pulled away from her. "Lily, don't leave," I cried, my voice echoing off the walls. But as the shadows consumed me, I felt myself falling backward, landing hard on the floor outside the room. Gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet. The door to room 12 stood wide open, the dark interior now silent. I looked around, disoriented, and then stumbled back to the nurse's station, heart racing. I spent the rest of my shift poring over the hospital's records, searching for any information about Lily and her mother. I found a file buried deep in the archives, a record of Lily's admission and her mother's name, Anna Reynolds. As I read through the notes, my heart ached for the girl who had been forgotten. Lily's story was tragic. She had lost her mother years before her admission and had never fully recovered from the trauma. The clock ticked slowly as the storm continued to rage outside, but I felt a sense of urgency. I knew I had to find Anna Reynolds. I gathered my courage and called the number listed in the records. After several rings, a voice answered, sounding weary and worn. "Hello? Miss Reynolds, this is Nurse Thompson from Green Hollow Hospital," I said, my heart pounding. "I need to talk to you about your daughter, Lily." There was a long pause on the other end. "Lily? I thought she was gone," Anna replied, her voice cracking. "She's not gone," I assured her. "She's still here. I spoke to her tonight." "What do you mean?" Anna's voice was trembling. "She's trapped in the hospital," I explained, trying to keep my composure. "She wants you to know she's still here and that she needs your help." Tears began to flow as Anna sobbed. I never stopped looking for her. I thought I had lost her forever. "Come to the hospital," I urged. "She needs you. She wants you to help her find peace." After a long conversation, Anna agreed to come to the hospital. The storm had started to ease, and by the time she arrived, I could feel the air shift. We walked together to room 12, and I opened the door, the shadows still lingering but less oppressive now. I could feel Lily's presence, and I knew she was watching. "Lily, your mother is here," I said softly. "You can finally be together." Anna stepped inside, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice filled with love and regret. "I never stopped looking for you." As she spoke, the shadows began to retreat, and I could see Lily's figure materializing, shimmering in the moonlight. "Mommy," she whispered, reaching out. Anna stepped forward, arms open wide. "I'm here, Lily. I'm here." In that moment, the room filled with a warm light, and the air became heavy with emotion. I watched as the shadows melted away, revealing a peaceful glow. "Thank you." Lily's voice echoed softly as she embraced her mother. "I'm free now." The air brightened, and I felt a weight lift from the room. The darkness dissipated, replaced by a serene stillness. I stepped back, tears in my eyes, as mother and daughter reunited. When I returned to the nurse's station, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The whispers were gone, the shadows had retreated, and for the first time in a long time, the hospital felt alive rather than haunted. From that night on, I made sure to remember every story, every life that passed through those walls. I understood now that even in the darkest places, love and remembrance could light the way. Story the end.
Story number 10.
As a surgical nurse at St. Augustine's Hospital, I had grown accustomed to the sterile smells of antiseptic and the sound of machines beeping rhythmically. Each night shift felt routine, but there was one particular night that would forever haunt me. It started like any other, but as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. A thunderstorm rumbled in the distance, and the lights flickered ominously, casting long shadows along the corridor. I was preparing for a late-night surgery on a patient named Mr. Henderson, a frail old man who had been admitted with a severe abdominal obstruction. The OR was cold, and the team was anxious, as surgery at this hour was always nerve-wracking. As we scrubbed in, a chill swept through the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I glanced around, noticing that the normally busy operating room seemed strangely quiet. Our anesthesiologist, Dr. Miller, was unusually silent, his face pale as he double-checked the anesthesia equipment. Once we began the procedure, everything felt normal at first. The lights above illuminated Mr. Henderson's frail form, and the team phoned the task at hand. As the surgery progressed, however, I began to hear faint whispers echoing through the sterile space. "Help! Help us!" The voices seemed to call, soft but persistent, floating through the air like a haunting melody. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, my voice low but urgent. Dr. Miller glanced at me, eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" I shook my head, unsure if I had imagined it. "I thought I heard." But before I could finish, the room temperature plummeted and the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a whirlwind. "Help! Help us!" The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the surgery, but the sensation of being watched overwhelmed me. Just as Dr. Thompson, the lead surgeon, began to remove the obstruction, the lights above flickered violently. "Stay focused, everyone," he said, but there was a tremor in his voice. "We can't let distractions get the best of us." As he spoke, I saw a dark figure standing just outside the operating room door. It was tall and shadowy, blending into the darkness. My heart raced as I squinted to get a better look, but the figure seemed to dissolve as soon as I blinked. "Is anyone out there?" I called out, but there was only silence. When I turned back to the operating table, Mr. Henderson's heart rate monitor beeped erratically. "His vitals are dropping," I shouted, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We worked quickly, but the whispers had intensified, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. "Help us! Help us!" The voices echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. "Someone needs to check the anesthesia." Dr. Thompson barked, and Dr. Miller rushed to the side of the machine. But just as he did, the lights flickered again, and a loud crash echoed through the room. We turned, startled as a tray of instruments fell to the floor, clattering loudly. "What the hell?" Dr. Thompson yelled, his frustration boiling over. The whispers became a cacophony, drowning out the sound of the machines. "Help us! We need you," they pleaded, a chorus of anguish that clawed at my sanity. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grip my arm. I whipped around, but no one was there. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed onto the counter, trying to steady myself. "Is anyone else feeling this?" I gasped, looking around at my colleagues. They all seemed frozen, eyes wide with fear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadowy figure again, standing at the back of the room, just beyond the bright lights. This time, it was clearer, an outline of a woman in a tattered surgical gown, her face pale and ghostly. "Help us!" she cried, her voice a desperate wail. "Get a grip!" Dr. Thompson shouted, but his voice trembled as he glanced at the apparition. "We need to finish this surgery." In that moment, the heart monitor flatlined, and the room plunged into chaos. "Code blue!" I shouted, rushing to Mr. Henderson's side. The whispers intensified, drowning out my thoughts. "Help us! Help us!" We worked frantically, but the figure remained watching with hollow eyes. As the chest compressions continued, I felt a rush of cold air, and for a moment everything froze. The whispers faded into silence, and I could see the shadowy figure clearly now. "Please, remember us," she implored, and in that moment I understood. "I will remember you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I promise." Just then, the heart monitor began to beep again. "He's stabilizing," Dr. Miller shouted, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. As the ghostly figure smiled faintly, she began to dissolve, the room warming as she faded away. The other nurses and doctors seemed to snap out of their stupor, returning to their tasks. "Keep going. We're almost there," Dr. Thompson urged, and we pressed on, the atmosphere in the room shifting back to focus on saving Mr. Henderson. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, we completed the surgery. As we cleaned up, I couldn't shake the feeling of gratitude mixed with sorrow for the spirits who had lingered in that room. The whispers were gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the machines. I took a deep breath, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself wandering the empty hallways, reflecting on what had happened. As I passed the surgical room, I glanced inside, remembering the voices that had filled the air. "Thank you," I whispered, knowing they had finally found peace. From that night on, I made it my mission to remember every patient and every story. St. Augustine's Hospital was filled with memories, some tragic, some beautiful, and I vowed to honor them all. Story the end.